Welcome to r/Reddit Revenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wrong. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. A rude drunk hostel guest set over 20 alarms disturbing everyone. I silenced and concealed her phone inconsiderately. The second story. Denied a raise. The resourceful designer claims $75,000 from the company for their .com domains, which they had registered when asked to build websites. The third story. Living near a crazy neighbor led to a series of bizarre disputes, culminating in a revenge plan involving sabotaging blaring speakers and a noisy music party. And the first story is: deprive sleep to 8 strangers, enjoy having no working phone on your trip abroad. Several years ago, I was traveling with an ex in Cambodia. It was our last night sleeping in a 10-bed dorm-style room in a hostel in Siem Reap, where the famous Angkor Wat temples are found. We'd been there for a beautiful couple days of viewing the ancient structures and getting mild food poisoning, and were planning to wake up early and catch a bus north to Laos in the next morning. Now, a popular activity at Angkor Wat is to wake up when it's still dark and watch the sunrise over the temples. I say this to help you understand that basically, most of the people sleeping in our big shared room, myself included, went to sleep extra early and were planning to drag ourselves out of bed before 5 a.m. for our own important reason. As most adults know, when you have to wake up that early, having a stranger refuse to make the most minimal effort not to wake you is a serious offense. Humans need sleep. Back to the story. It was 11 p.m., and those of us in the dorm had been lights out, passed out for at least an hour. It was then that a drunk couple returns to the room. They make no effort of trying to be quiet for the sake of the other 8 people there. They flip on the light for a half second before switching to phone lights and messily flopping into one of their beds. These dummies then begin making sounds with their mouths I can only describe as wet spaghetti-esque. Loud smooching. This goes on for long enough that at some point, someone attempts to politely shush the couple, which the girl responds to with a string of slurred FUs. Soon after, the girl gets into her bed, directly next to me, and they spend the next half hour slurring back and forth. I love you. I love you too. I miss you. Me too. I miss you so much. Good night, baby. Good night. I love you. I love you too, and on and on. They weren't even attempting to whisper. It was the romantic dialogue of a Nicholas Sparks novel if he'd written it while incapacitated by a high fever. I found myself praying that this couple would pull a notebook and both drop dead at the exact same time. But instead, it got worse. The pair of dummies finally passed out, but less than an hour later, girl dummy's phone alarm goes off. It wakes most of us up, but not her. It takes a minute of yelling by different bunkmates to wake her up enough to shut it down. A half hour later, it goes off again. This time, it takes even longer for her to awaken from her Captain Morgan-induced slumber and turn off her phone. This happened another 6 times. As her REM kicked in, it became harder to wake her enough for her to silence her alarm. Those of us in the room had to yell at this girl for multiple minutes before she'd finally comply. Several times, other people actually got out of bed to try and reason with her to shut down her phone entirely, but she was far too blacked out to even hear them. Finally, the alarm seemed to stop and I was able to fall back asleep, but not for long. When another one shrieked me awake, I was completely effing done. I had barely an hour left before I planned to wake up, pack my bag and head out, and I was physically and emotionally exhausted from this inconsiderate bee. I got up and tried to shake her awake. She was just gone. Nothing worked. I grabbed her fancy new iPhone and pushed it into her hand and insisted she open the lock screen so I could turn off her alarms. Somehow she actually managed it without even opening her eyes. Miracles do happen. I opened her app to turn off the alarm that's still blaring and see that this chick has 16 more alarms slated to go off before 10 a.m. Less than 30 minutes apart. They were labeled with SH like hair appointment and English class, meaning clearly this idiot set them way back before she left her home country, and not even considered shutting them off when she knew she'd be sleeping in a communal space. I've never been a vindictive person. I keep my revenge fantasies deep inside like most functional, empathetic adults. But I was furious at these inconsiderate drunk children who chose to F up a full night's sleep for several people currently in the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime trip. I turn off all her alarms and switch the phone to silent. Like an executioner marching a criminal to the chopping block, I carry it to the bathroom and drop it in the sink. The faucet goes on and becomes an aesthetic Tumblr gif. Clear water cascading over the shiny brand name phone. I give it a couple of minutes and then I return to the room and slide the phone under her mattress. We checked out of the hotel early, long before dummies 1 and 2 woke up for their breakfast shots. I'd say I managed about 2.5 hours sleep total, especially rough considering the full day of bus and boat rides we had ahead of us. My exhausted misery was softened by the solace I took in imagining this girl, who tortured us all for so many hours struggling to find her phone when she awoke, and if she was smart enough to look under her mattress, knowing that her phone was then water damaged and totally unusable. Her ability to take selfies in culturally inappropriate places and use her map apps to find the closest bar were long gone. Maybe she'd even be unable to check into her future hotels. All I know is traveling without a smartphone in this day and age is a challenge, much more difficult than not being an SH person. I belong to the group of people who rely on multiple alarms. I understand your frustration. I'd prefer not to rely on these alarms. They likely bother me more than they bother you. However, I've experienced firsthand how poorly I function without them. Having said that, I'm not inconsiderate like the intoxicated individual in this story. If I'm sharing a sleeping area with someone, I'll make an effort to turn off my alarms and arrange for someone else to wake me up. You've really shown me that you can deprive someone of undeserved comfort when they destroy other people's dreams. And if someone decides to start this game, they should be prepared for the possible consequences. And perhaps, I hope, next time these lovers will think twice before deciding to do this in the middle of the night in a dormitory. It's a great story. The second story is, company denied me a raise and then ignored my requests. Ended up paying me $75K for their .com domains. I worked for a startup company since the very early stages, as their only designer. For 2 years, I was responsible for everything web and graphic design related. Packaging, collaterals, product images, Amazon listings, etc. Because they couldn't offer me benefits, they hired me as an independent contractor, so I wasn't considered an employee at all. Fast forward 2 years later. The company is making millions a month selling on Amazon. I told them my rate was going to increase to reflect the success of the company and the role I played in such rapid growth. But they declined and told me they were going to end my contract. Later learned they were planning to hire someone in India to do the job cheaper. Before they terminated my contract, they asked me to make a website to start selling their products and set up a subscription-based model. They had several brands, so I had to make several websites for each brand. Because they couldn't be bothered to buy the hosting of the domain, I ended up building the whole thing on my personal hosting, with the intention of transferring everything once they bought everything needed to get the site live. Despite reminding them to buy the domains for all their brands and hosting so I could transfer everything before my contract was terminated, they ignore me. Notice that all their business was through Amazon, and they only owned the parent company domain. After my contract ended, I handed over the files and bought a lot of the domain variations for their brands. Brand.com, Brand.net, Brand.store, Brandindustry.com, etc. A couple of months went by and I got an email from the CEO asking why I didn't transfer ownership of the domains to them, and I forwarded him all my emails reminding them that it was their responsibility to register the domains and that I had bought the domains with my own money. After they terminated my contract, so I legally owned all of them. He tried to claim trademark violation and start litigation, so I offered to transfer ownership of all the domains for $30,000 each. They had 3 brands, so $90,000. After some back and forth, we settled for $75,000, signed a contract, and they cut me a check. Note, about 18 months after the company started it, got sanctioned by the FDA and FTC because the name of all the brands contained a restricted word that requires certification, which was used prominently in all materials, labels, and packaging. While the name trademark was not affected, the logo type had to be changed, effectively rebranding the whole thing. So the domains they wanted were not the exact trademark. Example, brand certified products equals brand products on the box and materials. Edit. It was making me and my wife nervous. We were in the middle of getting a home building loan for our new house, so the last thing I needed was extra expenses. With that money, we finished the basement of our current house and increased the rent value by $900 a month, since we added 2 rooms and another living room and 2 full bathrooms, so the difference paid itself in 2 years of rent. Having spent a considerable amount of time in the web hosting industry, I've witnessed this scenario occur much more frequently than one might expect. Typically, the individual responsible for IT matters set up everything under their own name. However, if they're later terminated or decide to leave the company without transferring ownership to the organization, it often leads to disputes where the company claims ownership of the assets. Instead of resorting to litigation, you made a good deal and took over the domains yourself, eventually forcing the company to pay you $75,000. The money properly used allowed you to improve your home and increase your rental income. It's crucial for companies to understand the value of their employees, especially someone as crucial as you were in their early days. While it's unfortunate that they didn't recognize your worth initially, I'm glad you were able to find a silver lining and come out on top. The third story is Crazy Neighbors. Petty Revenge Falls Apart. My family lives out in the country, so we don't really have to deal with neighbors except for one, and she's as crazy as they come. We've got a history of putting up with her BS simply to avoid the hassle of getting the police involved. I'll start with some craziness we've had to deal with in the past, and the events leading up to my petty revenge. FYI, our house is fairly close to the property line, which is an important factor in some of her antics. It's just the stories about how crazy she is. We have a bunch of chickens, and she has a couple too. She never had them locked up or anything, So they decided the grass was greener on the other side and started living with our flock of birds. We didn't really notice because we had a couple hundred at the time, and there were only 2 or 3 that came over. Apparently, she thought we stole them, so she came over, trespassing, and caught them and brought them back to her house, but they kept coming back over to our yard. So she accused us of stealing them, which was preposterous, since we didn't want them. We show our birds and hers were just some mixes that were worthless, and we definitely didn't take them for the eggs, since we have to get rid of hundreds of eggs a year. On to the actual story. It started with her deciding that she wanted some paths back in the woods behind our houses, so she could ride her four-wheeler back there. So she hired a landscaping company to come out and take out a bunch of trees and bulldoze a path back there for her. Despite having the property line marked, her path went a decent way onto our property. We told her she couldn't do that, and thought that that would be the end of it. She didn't agree. She started off small, riding her four-wheeler right on the property line whenever she heard us outside, but we barely noticed. Then she upped the ante. We started hearing her radio blaring all the time, including all night long. This actually bothered us, since we usually leave our windows open at night. We called the cops a couple weeks after the start of this, but they said they couldn't do anything about it during the day, and we would have to call back at night when the noise ordinances were in effect. But that was more hassle than my parents wanted, since they had to work early, and didn't want to spend several hours on a work night dealing with that. Then one day I was back in the woods cutting up some trees that had fallen in a storm, and noticed that there were a bunch of speakers right on the property line. 6 if I recall correctly, and they were decent outdoor speakers, all pointing towards our house. I decided that if my parents weren't going to do anything, I would, and started hatching my plot for revenge. The catalyst for my revenge came about a week later. Our phone went out, a pretty common occurrence, so we thought nothing of it. We called the phone company. They said there weren't any outages in the area, so it must be something with our lines. They sent a tech out. He started at the house and couldn't find anything wrong there, so he checked our box out by the road. A couple minutes later, he comes back and asks if we had anyone work on it recently. Nope, nothing of the sort. Then he took me out and showed me what was wrong. Someone had taken some bolt cutters, cut the lock off of the box and cut a bunch of wires inside, then closed it back up and put the lock back on so you wouldn't notice unless you took a close look. I had one suspect on the list. That night I went out and took care of business. I took a piece of wire and used it to reach through the protective screen on the front of them and poke holes in the cones of all the speakers. A couple hours later, blessed silence. The holes I poked had turned into tears. I still laugh picturing her wondering how all 6 of her decent quality speakers blew out at the same time. A week or so later, we heard the music going again, and my parents had remembered how nice it was to be able to sleep at night without SH music blaring. So they called the cops at 2 in the morning and had them make her shut her one-woman revenge party down. To solve the problem of the four-wheeled trail she built that crosses your land, consider installing an inexpensive fence to block access and install an accessible hunting camera nearby. Over time, if you record evidence of her trespassing on your property, you may want to file a claim in small claims court. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.